Welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast, helping engineers, producers, and artists create professional recordings and mixes, even from home. I'm your host, Mike and Davina. Let's get started. Hey, welcome to the Master Mix podcast. My name is Mike Navina, and thank you so much for hanging out with me today. Today, my guest is Maor Appelbaum. If you're not familiar with him, he is a mastering engineer based out of Los Angeles. He's worked with producers such as Sylvia Massey, Mark Lewis, Jacob Hansen, Tue Madsen, and so many more. He's worked with artists like Halford, Sepultura, Yngwie Malmsteen, and a ton more as well. And in this conversation, we have a really great chat about some of the challenges of working with clients and how you navigate communication with people so that you can make sure that you're giving people the best quality results and that everyone ultimately in the end is happy with the results that you're putting out. We also get into some really interesting conversation about remastering records and remastering classic records of legacy artists where people are so used to a certain sound with these records already. So, how do you add something new to it to really enhance the quality of those sounds? So we definitely get into some of that. And Maor is also a very creative mastering engineer, and he has this great philosophy on his gear and how he uses it. So, of course, I have to ask him about, his process and how he masters and how he incorporates creativity into the mastering process. So I think you're going to find this episode really fun, really interesting. Maor's got tons of great advice here. So let's just jump right into the episode. Maor Appelbaum, thank you so much for being on the Master Mix podcast. How's it going, man?
I'm doing good, keeping busy. We're very excited about soon having the plugin of the oven being launched. So it's been a bit of hectic weeks lately, working on that, working on other projects. But yeah, everything is good. I'm totally happy.
Awesome. Yeah, I would love to definitely get into definitely some of your story and definitely talking about the oven because I think it's such a cool plugin that's coming out, and I'm sure a lot of people will be curious to know what's involved with that. So to start off, maybe for people who aren't familiar with you, can you give us a little bit of your story and your background on how you got into music, how you got to doing mastering and all the cool stuff that you're working on these days?
Well, I'm a mastering engineer located in Los Angeles. I've been doing mastering for a lot of years, only mastering. But prior to that, like a lot of people, I was a musician, had my own kind of bands and projects. In my case, I wouldn't say I was a musician that was making money off music back then. I was more of like, it was a hobby that I really invested in. I really liked doing it. So I put a lot of time and effort and had, invested in it and released some music and did shows. Later on in time, I grew fond more of the technical side of recording and engineering and mixing and all that. But as much as I was recording my own bands and mixing my own bands, and I found that my forte is actually mastering because I had a background in broadcasting and in DJing and in music journalism. So it gave me the perception of how things are when they're out. Like being a DJ, I could see how a song affects people listening to it. Mm-hmm. As a radio DJ as well, or club DJ as well. And then as a music journalist, how the concept of a record is perceived as well. And then combining that with the technical experience and knowledge and the artistic approach, it just felt natural that I'll be doing mastering, which is kind of the buffer between the production and the listener. It's like the end step, the last creative and technical step before it's released to the world.
Yeah, I love that.
That's what got me. Of course, on the way to that, I did a lot of other audio related professions. If it's recording, if it's live, it's mixing, if it's mastering, if it's video, audio for video or audio for installation or, rehearsals, live rehearsal audio and a bunch of that kind of stuff. I came to America 15 years ago and I worked for producer Sylvia Massey. I worked at her studio back then called Radiostar Studio, and I was part of the staff engineers. Did some recording, some assisting, some mixing, some tech work, some mastering, some just all around being in the studio as part of the staff.
That's awesome.
And then I moved to LA and I just focused on mastering.
Very cool. So was your plan to always get into mastering, and then like all of the other stuff that you talked about, doing the mixing, recording, live sound, all that kind of stuff, was that just kind of like something to keep afloat and to just make a little bit of money to start off, or while you were learning the process, or did you kind of fall into mastering as a result of learning about all those other things?
Well, I was a broadcasting engineer for a lot of years. That paid my bills very well. And then after work, I was doing the other stuff that I liked, some tracking of my bands and recording, different stuff for us. And then, the projects, and then mixing, of course, them and all that. But I did the other stuff. Part of it was for my own interest of my own music and bands that I was involved with. And then mastering is something that I gravitated to and I wanted to continue. And I kept doing that on a smaller scale while I was doing broadcasting, which was paying me most of the bills. And in time, the mastering was adding more to my day-to-day and to my income professionally.
Mm-hmm.
Like it was, so, from broadcasting, that was the main thing. Mastering started to add and add and add, and it became bigger and bigger. And of course, later on, I just moved to that. On the way, I had to do other stuff too. Not exactly, well, some of it was for the paycheck, if you want to call it. And some of it was to expand my knowledge. And then with the expansion of the knowledge, then it was also clearer where I want to go to, what I want to do.
That makes sense.
I think of it as focal point.
For sure. Well, I like how you put it, that like with all of that experience in DJing and doing the media side of it and all the broadcasting and everything, like it kind of makes sense that mastering would maybe come natural to you, because you already had a sense of what that final product was, and like you said, the impact that it can make, and you're already so deep in absorbing like the final quality of a song and really understanding what that final vision should look like. So getting into mastering, that's really what it comes down to, is like making it get to that finish line and giving it that sweetened, polished sound. So it seems like that would be a natural thing for someone of your position. And obviously, like you said, if you're going back a step and getting into the mixing and the recording side of things too, then you're also understanding the process all the way through and really seeing how to make it sound great right from the source and not just at the ending, right?
Yeah. Well, in mastering, we don't have much control on what comes in. What we can do is, if there are issues that we can address by talking to the mixing engineer and having him fix it, then we get something better to work with. In some cases, we can't do that either. There's no communication, or that mix was an old mix and they can't revise it. Sometimes they don't want, because the artist is very attached to it as is. Sometimes the gear is not available. So, the first thing you do is you listen to it, see if you can fix it or work with it, or sometimes it doesn't need any fixing. Sometimes it's really good and only need enhancements. But if there is any issues that are hard to address without sacrificing it in a bad way, then you approach the people involved and see what's possible. At the end of the day, you want to make the listener enjoy the track as much as possible, and you want to make the artist, producer, whoever's involved, to be happy with it and feel that it brought something to the table that they needed. It could be minimal, it could be more than that.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's enough to be a 3%, and that makes it feel better.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's like 20%, 30%. And there are times where you help the mixer adjust the mix, and now, although you're not mixing it, but you're giving him mixing tips or suggestions on how to improve it, and then you're getting a better product in, and your involvement at that point was bigger. in terms of the percentage of effect.
For sure. Yeah, it's just adding more value to the process. The more
Yes.
the more you can keep those lines of communication open, and the more you can suggest things that ultimately, in the end, make the product sound way better. Then that's why people are hiring you.
Yeah. Sometimes you go above and beyond what's needed in order to improve the project. It's not reflecting on the outside like how people perceive your work because they don't know what you added. But if you helped it come in better to you, you're going to have a easier time working on it to achieve a better result, which will reflect as a better sounding master too.
Absolutely. And I think that that's one of the real strengths of hiring a mastering engineer is that, like, if you find a good mastering engineer like yourself who is willing to work with the mixing engineer and the artist and really kind of suggest those things that are necessary to make the mastering process easier and better, like, it's good to have someone in that position. And it's good to build relationships with mastering engineers that way. Like, rather than just like shopping around and constantly trying to find new engineers, it's like, it's great to have someone that you can trust and whose advice you trust and someone who's willing to provide that feedback for you. So, for anyone who's listening to this and trying to find a mastering engineer, like, look for someone who's willing to give you that feedback, because there are some people that don't. And to me, like, that's a shame, because it's just not helping the product at all, not helping the final results.
Well, this is a topic that a lot of times I see people debating. Are you being intrusive by saying what you think that can be better or not? Some mastering engineers will say, look, I take it as is, I respect it as is, and if that's how they want it, this is how I'm gonna work with it. There's others who are gonna be saying, oh, we gotta fix this and fix that. I sit on the line that's in between, and not because I'm trying to be on the fence. It's more about, if I see that there is a potential to fix something, I'll talk with the people. If not, I'll leave it as is. And it's a fine line. And sometimes when you step there, it makes people take a step back and maybe, oh, we don't want to deal with that. And sometimes they do. You never know who's your client for real during the project until certain things are happening, and that's where it's a tricky subject, because, as long as there's no problems and you're doing a good job, there's no problems. But if there's problems, how do you deal with that? You are risking your work on it, because if they don't like what they're hearing, they might decide to go somewhere else, and that happens. So I can understand why a lot of mastering engineers won't say anything, because they say, if it came to me this way, out of respect, I won't say anything, and I don't want to, insult or offend or say something that they won't like to hear, and move on, and that can happen a lot, So it's always walking on eggs. It could be walking on a landmine too, and you never know. I try to be helpful to my clients. I try to help them achieve better results from the get-go. If I can tell them do this and this and this, it will make it way better. And they do it, and it sounds way better. Hopefully they'll appreciate it. But I've came across situations where I would suggest something to a mixing guy, and he couldn't understand why what I said actually worked. And he didn't want to work with me anymore. And it's because I was helping him get a better result, which he didn't understand how it can happen. And it offended him. Of course, it's rare I get these people, but it was enough to get a person like that to understand that thing can happen. And of course, there were other situations that, people can misinterpret, what you're saying, or not try to get to connect with you and understand what can do good. And some people are just busy with what they're done, and they don't care if it can be better, because there's an ego, and you deal with all of it, like, to me, if somebody will tell me, look, I'm not happy, or I'm happy, but I want something else, well, tell me. That's what we want. We want to communicate. Tell me, like, what do you like? What you don't like? Like, I learned that what someone doesn't like is more important than what they like, because what they don't like, they know. What they like, a lot of times they like in other things, and or they're not sure.
That's so true. People have such a hard time articulating the things that they like, but it's so easy for them to be vocal when they don't like something.
Yeah. And I think that's where a lot of times it's important to make a call and talk about it. Emails are tricky because they're written, and when you read a written format, it's harder to feel the dynamics of it. It's always feeling like it's straight ahead. Even if you use polite words, it always has like a message that is hard to have a dynamic movement in it, where a phone conversation is very different because you can pause, you can inject a word, you can say something and see how the feedback is, and you get to something with, it's a two-way street. It's a dynamic street. Even if the guy is like totally going on a tangent about something specific, at least you can understand and ask more questions to understand it.
Absolutely. I love that. That's such a good point that I think a lot of people need to hear, because it's just, there's this tendency for people to just want to like hide behind email because it's so easy and convenient. But like sometimes it really doesn't turn out to be so convenient in the end, because you haven't had those lines of communication like you're talking about here. And a simple phone call would just solve things so much faster. So yeah, I think that's a really important point. So on the topic of kind of not really knowing what kind of client you're going to have until you make that suggestion, do you do anything before you start a session to kind of feel out if they're open to constructive criticism with their mixes, or is that kind of just like only in the moment you kind of feel that out?
Well, if a client only reaches by email and they don't want to communicate by phone, then you already know that your line of communication is limited. So you work on the project. If you come across a problem, you can articulate that in an email saying, I hear there's a lot of low end that I think is clogging this and this. If you would like to clean up the bass guitar or the bass synth, you can articulate that in an email. Of course, you hope that they're open to that. If they're willing to talk on the phone, then, and they are communicating with you on the phone, then already you know that there's a place where you guys meet. Like not a physical place as a club or a venue, but more of a virtual space that there's a communication that a voice communication. And in some cases, I'll ask the client, is this mix coming into me as is, and I got to work with it as is, no changes, or you're open to feedback. And if they say they're open to feedback, sometimes they actually declare that as like, hey, I want to hear what you think, and if I need to improve it. It's like there's a statement up front, and in some case you got to ask that.
Man, I 100% agree with everything you're talking about here, and just that importance of those lines of communication and trying to establish them early enough so that you know kind of what role your job is in this whole project, and how communicative you can be, and have these lines of conversation. So yeah, I definitely love that. I'd love to go back a little bit, and you were talking about working with Sylvia Massey, and that was one of the things that you're doing early on in your career. And I'm just curious to know, like Sylvia's awesome. I love her. She was one of my early guests, and she's just fantastic. And she's one of the most creative people I've ever met in the industry. So I'm curious to know, what was it like working with her, and like what kind of things were you doing with her?
Well, I came from a different background, and then I landed there. It was a huge studio. It was like four studios. One was it's a big complex that had a Neve in a theater, and then there was an SSL, and then there was a Tech Matchless, and then there was a Trident, like different rooms, and each room was occupied with different engineers, different gear. And as you said, Sylvia is very creative on the process, and she knows how to get those takes from the artist. And, that's what makes a great producer. And Sylvia is definitely, one of the most known, in her field, especially what she's done. And it was a very interesting experience because, first of all, I came from a different country, different language, different mentality. So now it's a different mentality and language, and to see her work with the bands and all the gear. There's a ton of gear, and I love the gear. And, so yeah, definitely it's a very interesting and learning experience. And I'm very creative in my mastering, so it definitely kind of fit the I'm trying to find the word. It's not like inspirational. It's kind of inspirational, but it's more of like it's on that level that you see someone creative and you're creative and you feel like, oh, this is interesting. This is, how this, what she does and how, I approach things. So definitely this was a good landing point for me, working for her, and I was there so many sessions and hours, and yeah, it was amazing experience.
Very cool. Well, you brought up an interesting point there that like, Sylvia is obviously like, she's so creative and she does so many like really non-traditional techniques in her productions. And I'm curious to know, like, has any of that passed on to the work you do with mastering? And you said you are pretty creative with mastering. So I'm assuming, would you say that you got that from Sylvia?
Well, I always was a mastering engineer that took things sometimes in a different way, and sometimes like I would choose if I'm intrusive, if I'm finesse, if I'm a little, if I'm more, sometimes I would reshape things like really big time. Sometimes I would keep safe, of course, in time you learn how to do it better and you learn what fits with what. But I came to it this way. Like that was my thing with mastering is I didn't have mentors in mastering. Nobody taught me mastering. So I had to pave my way, learn my way, pay my dues, figure out the things. I didn't have any references because I never worked for a mastering engineer. So I didn't know what is considered sounding good for them or what environment is the right environment. I didn't even have the best gear. I didn't have the right gear. I didn't like everything was very underground and figuring it out and making a ton of mistakes and seeing what worked, what didn't, what stick, what doesn't. So I was always creative in that form. And so, working for Sylvia was natural for me in terms of someone else is creative and I'm creative. And so it just made sense in terms of, oh, okay, I see she's trying this. And because I've done a lot of time, I've done a lot of masters where I would connect gear that would be like, no, this shouldn't work right. But it did, or weird, you put this device and it worked, so, and I've mastered lots of records with so many different types of gear. I own a ton of gear. I own even more. And I'm always listening and trying different things and experimenting with things and trying to make the master sound more interesting, more dimensional, like more surrounding, more embracing. I'll test whatever, like different cables, different clocks, different power units, different tubes. Like I'll play with it. You know what I mean? Like, and that's what I'm saying. The creative side was always there. And because I didn't have any mentors in mastering, then I didn't know where to go. I just went on a lot of roads together and somehow they led to the same place.
Yeah.
Keep doing it.
I love that. That's such a great outlook on it. And yeah, I imagine like having worked for her, like I just even reading her book, like there's so many different like approaches that she's used in there. And, like passing audio through a pickle and stuff like that. It's like, does anyone, like, I don't know anyone else who does it, but, for a creative mastering engineer, I'm assuming you've never done that for your masters, I'm sure, but.
No, we didn't use pickles and I didn't use any salads or any other stuff. But I can tell you this, a pickle is like a filter. That's when she did, the guitars and all that. So in my mastering world, everything is an EQ and everything is a filter and everything is like even a compressor is a filter or an EQ. Okay. Any box here or any cable or any converter or clock or whatever affects the sound. They're all types of filters or EQs. I have different converters because I'll toggle between them to hear which one fits the song better than the other. I might set it up on one converter and then toggle and then find the other converter fits best to my taste. I'm not using pickles, but I'm being creative on not just choosing one thing, but playing with other things and figuring out what works. Of course, I mean, if ever I'll need to do something really crazy, I'm open to that,
But yeah, I mean, I love that philosophy or that outlook on your gear and how every piece does have something to it, and it does affect the sound, whether it is adding its own flavor EQ wise or changing the attack and all that kind of stuff. It totally makes sense. So, understanding your gear really, really well is very important for anyone who's getting into this because yeah, you don't just slap on a piece of gear because someone told you it sounds good. It's like you have to understand what it's doing to your gear or what it's doing to your music and how it's affecting the sound. So, for someone like yourself who has lots of gear, like, yeah, you have to spend that time to really understand why you have all that gear and what it's good for and when to use it, right?
Yeah. If you look at the artistic side of it, like how does it sound, you'll be surprised how small things can make either small differences or big differences, but they affect how you hear it, not just on a tone, but on a feel. And at the end of the day, music has melody, rhythm, whatever, but every music has a sound, and that's how you feel it. Okay. The only time music doesn't have a sound it's when it's notated. So every musical piece is a sound piece, and that affects how you perceive the music as well.
Yeah, love that. That's awesome. So as far as being creative and mastering, and you said that there's been some times where you've gone pretty extreme with stuff. How do you go about making those creative decisions? I guess it kind of ties back to what we were talking about earlier, where you have lines of communication with your clients. Like when you're being extreme with your mastering, are you ever consulting the clients before you do that to be like, I think I got this really good idea. Can I try this? Or are you just kind of going for it and then seeing what they think?
Good question, by the way. I think it's really dependent on the artist. Some artists, they need it. They need that sound to be extreme. And then you go that route and you give it to them and either they like it or not. Some artists, you got to be very careful and you got to figure out where you're going too much. Even if it sounds good, sometimes it could be alienating what they were doing, especially with legacy artists, which I've done a lot of them. They have a sound. Even if they change a bit the sound, they still have something that represents them. And if you can keep that and still move to a new dimension, but still have that, works great. Sometimes that dimension is changing too much, and then you're alienating that feel. And that's why some remasters don't sound good, is because they take you to a different place than what the original version of the song was. To me, the ideal remastering situation is when you have the feel of the song, but you could extend the elements to a point where it's not too much going further and feeling like it's a total like over detailed, but more of like get the feel and extend what was missing then to make it even better.
Yeah, that's such an interesting topic because I feel like remastering has got to be a pretty scary thing, especially for bigger legacy artists, because these records have been out for so long. People know them as a certain sound and have experienced those songs and so many elements of their lives for years and years. So to tackle a remaster, I imagine that would be a little intimidating sometimes getting into it.
It is, especially if it's a record you like. Another thing is if you're doing a comeback record for a band. There's some bands I worked with that haven't done records in a long time. And when you do a comeback record, if that comeback record is a natural progression from where they stopped 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 18 years ago, whatever, then you want to keep that feel going. Even if you're a bit more modern and 10, 15 years, you want to make sure that the audience that listens to it doesn't think, I like the old sound. You want to keep that feel where even if they progressed, it still resembles them. And then there are situations where the band did a comeback, but moved to a totally different place. And that's also good. And then you can approach it with new.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's such an interesting topic because, yeah, especially with like those comeback records where people have spent, 10, 15 years or longer between albums, like the technology has changed significantly since then. So, I imagine some of these older legacy acts like that were recording all analog, now they're doing all digital recordings, and like that in itself is going to change the sound. So, there's that fine line of trying to make it sound like the older style, but they're using new technology. And sometimes like that new technology might not give you that same result as what they used to use. So there's got to be like a very fine line that you're straddling there, right?
Right. Every few years, technology has a kind of a leap in the sound. And that's one of the things. The other thing is, even if they recorded digital, we're still progressing with the quality. And also there's a different way of consuming things. If they go for the same route as CDs and vinyl as back then, yeah, then the consumption isn't that way. But when it's streaming, even though you can still do the same thing from CD and, to streaming, sometimes the audience changes. Okay. And if you have new audience and they're used to a certain sound, now you give them something that is different. It's a guessing game, to be honest with you. Like, I think that the artists, they're doing their art, hoping the fans will like it. They like it, but they're hoping the fans will like it. And when we are working on something, we're doing what we think is right, but it's what we think is right. So I think there's a guess factor here. We guess it's right. And if it sticks and people dig it, then we guessed right and it worked for us. And then people are like, oh man, we love this record, So
yeah. No, that's so interesting. And I 100% agree that like, yeah, there is that element of guessing. And, anytime you bring someone new into a project too, you're adding their creative vision to the whole process as well. So, people are hiring you because they are familiar with a lot of your records and the sound of the stuff that you've worked on. So, people are hoping that they understand what your vision is and how that's going to affect their music. But you might get the song and have something different in your mind, right? So it's such a fascinating topic. You can definitely go very deep with that. Very cool. Well, we were talking a little bit about gear and how you really are very deep with your gear and paying attention to all the cool stuff that you've got and how it affects the channels. And at the very beginning, you had mentioned the oven, and I know that's a really cool piece of gear that you've got at your studio. And I was wondering if you could talk about it and the upcoming Plugin Alliance release of it.
Sure. So a lot of my gear in the studio is either custom built for me with me, which means I work with a builder, designer, and we work together to build something that will fit my needs in terms of functionality and sonic imprint. So those are the custom gears, which I'm part of the design. Then there are gears that were custom modified for me, which means they had their original form and then they had some tweaks done to fit my needs. So those are custom modified. And then there's pieces of gear that are as is, which I like them as is, and I work with them as is. So the ones that are as is, they're top tier mastering stuff. The ones that are tweaked for me with me, that are just modified for me, then we test out stuff and we see what sounds cool to my ears. And those, in time, I learned what I want more from them, and then we would tweak, or I would change something myself, or somebody will work with me on it. And then the ones that were custom built and designed with me as a collaboration. So I work with a builder designer and we work together. That's from scratch. That's from the beginning. We have ideas and we implement them and we do test runs of something we've done. And then if it doesn't sound good, we start from scratch. It takes a while till we find what we want exactly and how to make it work. And then once we do that, then we start prototyping. And then with the prototyping, there's a lot of back and forth to make sure it's exactly what we want, or we need to tweak it. So it's a whole process. And I have quite a lot of custom built and designed gear that's with me and a builder. Most of it is only for me, but I have a collaboration with the company Handy Amps, where we collaborate on a specific line of products. So Handy Amps have their own line of products that, compressors, EQs, preamps, and 1 watt tube power amplifiers and solid state amplifiers. And then we have a collaboration line that's called the oven line, which there's the oven, there's the stove, there's the toaster, and there's a few other. The oven and the stove, they're stereo processing units that have like Mojo box type. So they have coloration, saturation, tone shaping, like EQing in them. And you can combine all of them and they change based on how you push one knob into the other. And so they're very reactive. The oven is very thick and round and big sounding. The stove is very tight and clean and kind of punchy, more punchy, tight. The stove is coming out soon. It's already finished after prototyping, and there are people who own a stove, but we haven't posted about it much and haven't put it on the website, but we'll do that soon. So maybe by the time this podcast will be out, the stove page will be out. But
so just to clarify for people, so a lot of this gear you're building as analog gear, but now there are plug-in equivalents of this out or about to come out.
Not yet. So
Okay.
A lot of this stuff, like the stove, there's no plug-in yet. The toaster's going to be out soon. That's a mono channel strip, a high voltage solid state with a tube buffer and an optical compressor and an EQ. That is not yet out. Will be out. The only one that's out now is the oven, which has been out for a while. And that's a hardware. And we signed with Brainworks and Plugin Alliance to release a plugin version of it. So we had to work with them to make sure we can translate this to plugin world, because even if you model hardware, there's limitations of how much hardware will work the same in plugin domain. There are certain things that work as a reaction to other gear. There are certain things that an actual box sounds in a certain way. So when you move to plugin world, some stuff has to be adjusted to fit that. There's different calibrations to work in, different functions to make sure that if someone puts it on a mix bus or a drum bus or anything like that, they don't have to make too many changes to the benefit of it. So there's a lot of work to do, and it takes a while to actually model it. And especially because this is something that was never done before. It's this specific unit. It's not something that had a legacy prior to it that you can compare in different clones or versions or even other plugins in the market that are of the same unit. So you can compare. This is fresh, new. There's no plugin of that yet. And there are not many units out there anyway. So it took a while to really hone it and make sure when you press, bypass, unbypass, and you move the knobs, you're like, oh wow, this is really cool what it can do, because it can go from really, really subtle to really aggressive. Maybe not horrible aggressive, but very aggressive. And of course, when I say horrible, I mean, yeah, you can distort it, you can make it sound crappy. But when I say not horrible, I mean like it's useful. You can find the sweet spot that will be useful for you. It's not like the knob sits in one sweet spot and you move it a bit, now everything is crappy. It has a range. You can go really, really subtle and add a tad. You can add a bit more. And then you can go aggressive and you can crap the hell out of it, of course, which maybe is not useful for most cases, but you might find a reason to do that for a certain effect if you want. It has a big range and lots of the flexibility factor here is huge, and it's very versatile because you can use it on so many different styles of music or instruments or mix bus or master bus, whatever you want to use it on.
Very cool. So yeah, is that how you see people using this, as primarily a mastering tool and just using it on like a mastering bus? Or do you think people will find uses for it on specific instruments as well?
No, this is all around. This is what I call a mastering grade production tool. You can use it on anything you want, and you can achieve great results with it because it's subtle enough to be on a master bus, but you can go aggressive with it, and you can go on any instruments from drums, bass, vocals, guitar, synths, 808s, drum bus, guitar bus, mix bus, mastering bus. You can use it on everything for real. Like, I'm not just saying that. You can actually find a use for it on everything. But like I said, it's done so well that it can be subtle enough for a mastering situations or mix bus, but you can just crank it hard if you want.
Yeah, very cool. Very cool. I love that. I'm looking forward to checking it out once it comes out. It definitely, do you have a date for that yet, or?
Because I don't work for the company itself, I don't know the release dates, but I know it's Q3. So it's probably not too far from now. Maybe, I don't know when, but I can tell you from the testing of it, it's really good. Like, I'm very happy with it.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, before we started, like I was saying that I got an email yesterday from Plugin Alliance talking about the new plugins that were coming out, and that was one of them. So yeah, very excited to see that coming out shortly. Yeah. So I mean, we've covered a lot about your gear and your past and all that, and I'd love to know, with all of this like creative approach to your mastering and understanding all the equipment and stuff like that, how do you start a mastering gig? Like, what's your mindset going into it? Because you have all of these tools available. So do you ever feel like it's overwhelming to get started, or do you like, what's your normal thought process going into it?
Well, first of all, you got to listen to the music, like, and a lot of clues are there. You listen to the music, and then you can try things out. And some stuff will work, some stuff won't. But first thing is just listen to the music, see what's good and what's missing and what's not needing to touch much. Like you kind of have to analyze it quite fast. And then you're trying different things. And when you're trying, some stuff for sure it's not going to work. And some stuff you try and figure out it doesn't work, or it does work. But I think there's clues in what you get. So when you listen to it, you don't need to analyze frequency-wise first. You need to more listen to, do I get enough impact from it? Or is there something cluttering it? Is there some mud or harshness, but not specific frequency, just to feel it, Because sometimes you'll fix a frequency in there, and that frequency you fixed, now it makes it feel either dull or not energetic. And that's a fine line. Some problems you want to keep because they have the energy, and some problems you want to fix. So you kind of analyze it quick. And then another thing that I learned is, even from hearing it, not always how it's going to respond, because some stuff might sound good, but once you start applying limiters on it or other processing, it will start sounding weird or triggering the limiters too much, because maybe there's some sub frequencies there you're not hearing, or it makes a unit start to sound weird because there's certain frequencies that are triggering something there too. So even when you listen the first time with no gear or no processing involved, even if it sounds right, it might change once you start processing it.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I love the way you describe that, of how you're analyzing your tracks, because I think that's one of the things a lot of people don't quite understand about mastering, is like, a lot of people don't know really what to expect from it. And I think by talking about the energy and like what's being muddy or what's causing the mud and all that kind of stuff, like, those are the elements that really you need to look into to make sure that you're getting the clearest master, right?
Well, I have to say, clearest is not always what the result is needing. Like, sometimes detail can change a perception of it and actually sound less good. I don't think that the ideal master is, it has to be detailed and bright and this and this. The ideal master is what makes the song feel closer to the intention of the song, or what connects more the listener with that song. And it doesn't have to be a set of rules that are technical. Like there's no dB number or frequency and dB number to be of that criteria.
Absolutely. Yeah, I do agree with that for sure. Like, I think a lot of people do tend to sweat those small details of, what number or what level does it need to be and that kind of thing. And it distracts from really the bigger picture of what it should sound like and how it affects the listener. Because that's ultimately what we're after. Nobody cares about what levels of the thing's at. They'll turn up their speakers happily if it's a good song, So, yeah. So then as far as your signal chain when you're mastering, do you have a typical signal chain that you like to use?
Well, like I mentioned before, I have different DAs. So I I pitch from different DAs, and then I have different A to Ds, and I can, just by changing them, you're already changing the color of the sound and how things are, coming into you, if they're super detailed or smooth, or if it's emphasizing certain elements. And then I have my insert console has different chains on each insert. So I can put insert 1 and then I have like 3 devices. Insert 2, I have 2. Insert 3, I have so each one has a different setup, and I can combine them too in a row. So I'll just play around with what really works for me. And, if the client says they didn't like it, then we can go back and make changes.
Yeah. With those different chains that you have, are those kind of already pre-set up to some degree, or is it just you kind of customize each chain based on what you think?
I customized each chain that it can work together. So either each chain can work on its own in terms of each element of the chain. Let's say you have 3 devices in the chain. They can each work on their own, or they can work good combined. So each chain is a combination of things that give me different tones, but also can work together and complement each other. So they're not working against themselves. So you know what I mean? So I have the variety. I can go like, oh, device A, device B. You know what? Device A and B. So the chains are customized to give me those options.
Very cool. Very cool. So then how long does it typically take you to master a track?
Tough question. I don't know. Depends on what I'm getting and how I'm dealing with it. And sometimes I have to bring it back to the mixer to fix it. And that's time that's already lost just trying to work it. Then you wait for the new one. But in some cases, you get it quick. In some cases, it's really good, but you don't want to ruin it. So that also can take time, figuring out what enhances it without ruining it. There's no set time. I've worked sometimes on one track a long time, sometimes short. I don't know. I prefer not gauging it, because then I'll limit myself to how much I need to spend on each one, which I don't think is good for me, because if I need more, I'll put more.
Fair. Absolutely. That makes sense. I mean, your job is to just make it sound as good as you can, and however long that takes you have to do that. So yeah, there's no time limit with it, really. So how do you know then, and I think I know what your answer is going to be, because I think you've kind of hinted at this already, but like, how do you know when you're done mastering a song?
Oh, I love that question. That's one of those questions that when I have to answer it, I just say, I hope I got it right. Like, or I think I'm there. I mean, like, look, how do you know when you finish doing something that is not gauged by time? Like, how do you know when you finished writing the song? Maybe when did you finish your work, if you have like a 9 to 5 and you're ending at 5, right? But when you have creative decisions and ideas, and when you're working on something artistic, how do you know when you're finished? Well, I guess you feel it, and then hopefully that resonates with the client. Now, if it does, great. If it doesn't, then you need to go back and now figure out what resonates with them. that can take time too.
Yeah, of course.
So,
yeah. It's such a tricky thing because you're right. Like you're always kind of just hoping that it's right and that it sounds good. And I think sometimes like it's so easy to get in your head about the quality of your own work. And for a lot of people, that can be a spot where they just freeze and they maybe don't make any progress because they're just stuck in that like self-doubt mode. Right. And, that happens at, from this podcast, I've heard so many people say that this happens to them at all sorts of levels of their career, whether you're just getting started or whether you've been at this for a while, there's always still that fear of like, what if I messed up, So it's very interesting. I find talking to people about that. I'm curious to know, like, was there a certain point in your career where you felt like you started making good masters and you were like, I know that I should be like, I know I'm good at this, or maybe it was early in your earlier stages where you're like, I'm good at this enough that I should make a career out of this?
I think like any artistic and technical profession, especially when you're serving other people, there are going to be mistakes. There are going to be times where you mess up, and you need to learn from each situation. From the good, you need to learn, and from the bad. You probably need to learn more from the bad because you want to avoid repeating those situations, and they will repeat themselves in certain ways. So you want to minimize that. And then on the good ones, you want to learn from that, like what resonates with that client specifically, or, you probably gain better perspective as you do more of it. Okay. And the more you do, you figure out what more people like. It doesn't mean you're going to nail it out every time. Okay. There's always kind of a inside fear, which some will admit, some won't, or some will just feel less of it. So they're not really feeling it much and they're approached by it. But, we want to make sure we're doing our job good and what we're doing gets people excited. You have to come to it with passion and drive, and know that even if it's messing up, you want to make it work. You want to fix it. There are times where things don't work out. Either you want to improve on that and make it better, or sometimes you're tired of the project and you don't want to do it because people are behaving bad on or just crappy sounding, and there's a limit to what you know how to do with it. And there's so many situations, when you're dealing with people, sometimes you just don't want to be involved because the way it's going, or there's no future in it, and in other cases, you really want to be involved with it because it's great music that you just enjoy working on, or it's cool to be part of something, or even you worked with this band a lot of times before and you're continuing your legacy with them, and you get excited from that, or you're working on something that really challenges you, and you know that if you do this and you do it right, you're going to get somewhere from it. Either you're going to get hired more by them or hired by other people who would love that, the result that you have achieved with this. It's a never know. And you also never know how much that project is going to impact you. Like I worked with some artists that were huge and it didn't do anything to my career in terms getting me more records. It maybe showed people that I was doing these records, but I wouldn't get calls from them. And then there's records that were smaller and they actually got me a lot of gigs, and there's records that were legacy and there was a lot of weight for it. And, people were like expecting, and then when it came out, it just, wow, people were so excited. And that also got me a lot. So you really never know which project is going to land you your next gigs. And sometimes it's a small project that just has a lot of following, or people just digged it and they're like, wow, this is cool. And sometimes it's a big project. Let's say this, there are projects that might not do much, but they still pay the bills, right? And that can help you buy more gear. It can help you keep the light on, the food on the table, so, it's not bad taking them,
For sure. But to your point there, it's like every project you have to treat as equal, because you don't know the effect of that or the impact of that album until it's out in the wild. And then, like you said, it could surprise you and, be the one album that maybe you didn't expect to be the most beneficial to your career, but then it is, so you definitely have to treat things very like equal and passionately, seriously, as far as the technical stuff. And I think that's a really important thing for people to realize, like, don't half-ass projects just because you don't think it's going to do anything for you. Just like take every project seriously. And sometimes it'll surprise you with what that can bring to you.
Yeah. And sometimes the person involved in that project's really appreciated your work, and they'll bring you a friend. Okay. And they will hire you again, and they'll appreciate the work that they'll be, wanting you to succeed more by, they take it on a personal level. This guy helped me get these results. I'm going to send him all my friends. I'm going to talk about him online. You never know. It's a service.
Absolutely.
Thing, and if we bring good service, it can bring us good clients too.
Love that. That's a great, I think that's a great spot to start to wrap up here. So, first off, thank you for taking the time to do this, and all of the advice that you've given here, I think is so important for people to hear. And there's a lot of great stuff people can take from this. If people want to learn more about you and your services and maybe even work with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, I have a website. It's www.maorappelbaum.com, maorappelbaum.com. I have a few Facebooks, so I could be found on Facebooks, Maor Appelbaum, MAORAPPELBAUM. They can get in touch with me through those channels. They can get in touch with you, and you can give them my info as well.
Of course, yeah. Absolutely, man. Well, Maor, thank you so much again for taking the time to do this. It's been awesome.
You're welcome. It was my pleasure. I enjoyed your questions, and it was really fun doing this podcast with you. And sorry for telling you people to get in touch with you, to get in touch with me.
It's all good.
I just had to make it funny.
It's all. It kind of reminds me of like back in the day, I used to tour manage bands, and one of the first bands I tour managed, they did, without telling me, whenever they met a girl on the road, they would always give the girl my number so that if they were crazy, they would be dealing with me and not the band. And so it's just an extension of that. I love it.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, I think it's great that you're doing this podcast, and a lot of people can benefit from it. And you're bringing great guests, from what I understand. So basically, you're giving an opportunity for people to drop knowledge to the listeners, and that's very important, because at the end of the day, we're a big community that's really small. There's a lot of people in this community, but it's a small community if you compare it to other types of communities.
Of course.
And we all want to do music or work on music. We want to get appreciated for what we're doing. We want to be challenged so we can get better, and hopefully we can get paid and make a living out of it, or at least add on to our pay, or even if we're not getting paid, we want to get better doing this because it fulfills us.
So that was Maor Appelbaum, and that was a really fun conversation. I hope that you enjoyed that. And I just thought it was really interesting, and I thought he brought up a lot of really interesting topics. I loved getting into the topic of remastering records and, preserving the integrity of an artist when they're using new technologies and that kind of thing. I thought that was a really interesting conversation that we don't get to talk about too much, especially on this podcast. I don't think we've chatted about it before. So really fun to get into that. And it was also really cool to hear about his process of building gear and how he has modeled that into plugins that are now going to be available, or at least shortly they will be available, so that you can use these from home and get a little flavor of some of the cool stuff that he's working on. So definitely make sure to keep an eye out on the Plugin Alliance plugins when they come out, and definitely try them out in your own mixes. So that was a lot of fun. I hope that you enjoyed that. And if you did, make sure to subscribe to the podcast. That way you're notified about all new episodes as they go live. And definitely make sure to visit masteryourmix.com. That is where I help out musicians with creating pro sounding recordings from their home studios. And on the website, you definitely want to check out the Mixing Mindset book if you haven't already. That is a book where I break down the process of mixing step by step so that you know exactly what steps to take, what order to work in, what to be listening for, how to dial in your settings so that you can feel confident throughout the entire process. So definitely check that out. It's called The Mixing Mindset, and that's available at masteryourmix.com. And that is it for this episode. So once again, thank you so much for sticking around to the very end, and I look forward to chatting with you in the next one. Take care. Later. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. To have your questions answered, submit your questions to questions@masteryourmix.com. Please go to iTunes and subscribe and leave a review. And for more information on how you can improve your mixes, visit masteryourmix.com.